The morning sun cast long shadows across Michigan Avenue as Henry Clark made his way down the busy street. He was 72 years old with gray hair and a face marked by decades of life experience. His clothes were clean but showed their age with faded colors and worn patches at the elbows. Over his right shoulder hung a canvas sack that had seen better days. The bag bulged with contents that shifted slightly as he walked, with the measured pace of someone who had learned long ago that rushing through life only made you miss the important details. Downtown Chicago was already alive with activity. Men and women in expensive suits hurried past clutching coffee cups and briefcases. Car horns blared in the street. The smell of fresh bagels drifted from a nearby shop. Henry breathed it all in as he approached the tall building that housed Metropolitan Trust Bank. The structure rose 30 stories into the autumn sky with walls of glass and steel that reflected the morning light. The entrance was grand with marble columns and brass fixtures polished to a mirror shine. A group of young professionals stood near the entrance taking a smoke break before starting their workday. Brandon Cole was among them, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His tie was perfectly knotted, and his shoes gleamed. Next to him stood Lisa Hoffman, in a designer dress and heels that clicked on the sidewalk when she moved. They were laughing about something when Brandon noticed Henry approaching. Brandon nudged Lisa and tilted his head toward Henry. She turned to look, and her expression changed to one of mild disgust. Henry was still 50 feet away, but he could see them talking and glancing in his direction. He had lived long enough to recognize that look. He had seen it countless times throughout his life. It was the look people gave when they decided someone was beneath them, without knowing anything about who that person really was. As Henry got closer, Brandon spoke loud enough for everyone around to hear. He said something about homeless people getting too comfortable in nice neighborhoods. Lisa laughed and added that security should really do something about keeping those types away from the bank entrance. A few other people in the group chuckled. One man in a gray suit suggested that the city was going downhill when people like that could just wander around wherever they wanted. Henry kept walking. His face showed no reaction to their words. He had learned decades ago that responding to such comments only made situations worse. Besides, he was curious to see how far this would go. He adjusted the sack on his shoulder and continued straight toward the entrance where the group stood. Their laughter grew louder. Someone made a comment about can collectors, and another person wondered aloud if he was looking for handouts. Paul Martinez was working security that morning. He had been with the bank for 3 years and took his job seriously. When he noticed the commotion, he walked over to see what was happening. Paul saw Henry approaching and the group of employees making comments. He glanced at Henry's worn clothes and the old sack. Without asking any questions, Paul positioned himself between Henry and the entrance. His hand rested near his radio as he watched Henry with suspicious eyes. Henry stopped a few feet from the entrance. He looked at Paul and then at the group of young professionals who were still smirking. The morning crowd continued flowing around them, but several people had stopped to watch what was happening. A woman with a shopping bag whispered to her friend about how these people had no shame anymore. A man in jogging clothes shook his head and said something about respect for private property. Brandon was feeling bold now that he had an audience. He made another comment suggesting that Henry was probably looking through the trash for cans to recycle. Lisa added that it was sad how some people ended up in life. She said it in a tone that suggested she felt no actual sadness at all. The group laughed again, and Brandon high-fived one of his colleagues. They seemed to think they were providing some kind of public service by pointing out someone they viewed as undesirable. Henry finally spoke. His voice was calm and quiet but clear. He said he needed to enter the bank. Paul stepped forward and asked if he had an account there. Henry said yes. Paul looked doubtful, but asked for identification. Henry reached into his jacket pocket slowly so as not to alarm anyone. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and extracted a card. Paul took it and examined it briefly. It was a valid ID with Henry's name and photo. Paul handed it back but still looked uncertain. Brandon called out, asking if they needed him to translate or something. More laughter followed. Lisa said security should really verify that someone like that actually has business in the bank. She suggested he probably opened an account with $5 10 years ago and now acted like he owned the place. The crowd, that had gathered seemed divided between those who found the situation amusing and those who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Paul asked Henry what his business was at the bank. Henry said he needed to speak with the manager. This caused an eruption of laughter from the group. Brandon said the manager of Metropolitan Trust did not take meetings with random people off the street. Lisa added that you needed an appointment and probably a minimum account balance of several $100,000 to even get on the manager's calendar. Henry remained patient. He told Paul again that he needed to enter the bank and speak with someone in charge. Paul looked torn between his duty to protect the bank from potential problems and his basic sense that maybe he should not judge someone entirely by their appearance. But the pressure from the watching crowd and the comments from the bank employees tipped the scale. He told Henry that without an appointment, he could not just demand to see the manager. He suggested Henry call the customer service number if he had concerns about his account. The situation had reached an impasse. Henry stood his ground with quiet dignity while Paul blocked his path and the crowd continued making comments. Brandon was emboldened by the attention and made increasingly rude suggestions about where Henry should go instead. Lisa recorded part of the encounter on her phone, saying it would make a funny story to share later. Other bank employees who had come outside to see what was happening stood by watching without intervening. Henry shifted the canvas sack to his other shoulder. He looked up at the tall building that housed Metropolitan Trust Bank. Behind those walls of glass and steel was an institution he had helped create. These people laughing at him had no idea. They were mocking one of the men who made their jobs possible. But Henry did not tell them this. Not yet. He wanted to see how deep this went. He wanted to understand what his bank had become when nobody thought the owner was watching. So he simply stood there absorbing their mockery and filing away every detail in his memory. Paul Martinez finally stepped aside after checking with someone on his radio. Henry walked through the revolving doors into the bank lobby. The contrast between the street outside and the interior was striking. The lobby soared 3 stories high with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Marble floors gleamed under carefully positioned lights. The walls featured expensive artwork and the furniture looked like it belonged in a palace rather than a bank. Everything about the space was designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Henry stood just inside the entrance for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The canvas sack hung from his shoulder, looking even more out of place here than it had outside. Around the lobby, well-dressed customers conducted their banking business. Women in pearls waited in plush chairs. Men in tailored suits spoke quietly into phones. Tellers worked behind a long marble counter helping people with transactions. Every surface shined. Every sound echoed. It was a temple to money, and everyone present seemed to worship accordingly. The moment Henry entered, people began to notice him. A woman in a fur coat, despite the mild weather, pulled her purse closer. A businessman in line for a teller glanced over and frowned. Conversations paused as heads turned. Whispers started spreading through the lobby like ripples on a pond. Security by the elevator straightened up and watched Henry's every move. The atmosphere changed from routine banking business to something more tense. Karen Phillips had worked as a senior teller at Metropolitan Trust for 15 years. She knew the rhythms of the bank like she knew her own heartbeat. She could spot a new account holder from across the room. She knew which customers had money problems before they said a word, and she knew when someone did not belong. From her position behind the counter, she saw Henry enter and immediately made assumptions. His clothes told her one story. The old sack told her another. Together they spelled out someone who was either lost or confused or possibly looking for charity. Karen caught the attention of Danny Cooper, who worked security on the main floor. She nodded toward Henry and made a subtle gesture. Danny was younger than Paul and sometimes overeager to prove himself. He walked over to Henry with purposeful steps. His uniform was crisp and his badge gleamed. He positioned himself in front of Henry, blocking any further progress into the lobby. He asked in a voice loud enough for nearby customers to hear if Henry needed help finding a shelter or social services office. Henry looked at Danny with patient eyes. He said no thank you. He explained he was here to conduct bank business. Danny glanced at the canvas sack and clearly did not believe him. He said the bank was very busy, and if Henry did not have specific business, he needed to move along. Other customers were watching now. Some looked nervous. Others looked annoyed. A few looked sympathetic, but none said anything. Henry repeated that he needed to speak with the bank manager. His voice remained calm but firm. Danny actually laughed at this. He said the manager did not meet with walk-ins. He explained there was a process for appointments and concerns should go through proper channels. Henry said this matter was important enough that proper channels could be bypassed. He was polite but insistent. His tone suggested he was not someone who would be easily dismissed despite his appearance. The exchange was drawing more attention. Customers in line were craning their necks to see. Tellers had stopped working to watch. Even the security guard by the elevator had moved closer. Karen picked up her phone and made a quick call. Within 2 minutes, Gregory Nash appeared from the elevator. Gregory was the assistant bank manager, and he carried himself with the authority of someone who had worked hard to reach his position. His suit was expensive. His watch was Swiss, his haircut was fresh. Everything about him projected success and competence. Gregory walked across the marble floor with confident steps. He took in the situation immediately. An elderly man in shabby clothes with a dirty sack was causing a disturbance in his pristine lobby. Customers looked uncomfortable. Staff looked uncertain. This needed to be handled quickly and decisively. He reached Henry and Danny and asked what the problem was. Danny explained that this gentleman was asking to see the manager. Gregory looked Henry up and down, making no effort to hide his assessment. Gregory asked Henry what possible business he could have that required the manager's personal attention. His tone was dismissive and slightly mocking. Henry responded that he preferred to discuss it privately with someone who had authority. Gregory's expression hardened. He said this was a prestigious financial institution, not a community center or welfare office. He said if Henry had legitimate business, he could make an appointment through proper channels. If he did not have legitimate business, then he needed to leave immediately. Henry did not move. He simply stood there holding his sack and looking at Gregory with eyes that had seen far more than this young man could imagine. He said again that his business was important to the bank. Gregory's patience was wearing thin. He raised his voice slightly, asking what business a man who looked like he lived on the streets could possibly have at Metropolitan Trust. The question hung in the air. Several customers gasped at the bluntness. Karen covered her mouth. Danny shifted uncomfortably, but Gregory did not stop. He was on a roll now. He said the bank served serious clients with serious money. He said they did not have time to deal with people looking for handouts or trying to cash suspicious checks. He suggested that Henry leave voluntarily or security would escort him out. And if Henry refused, then the police would be called. Other customers were nodding in agreement. A few were recording the encounter on their phones. The general consensus seemed to be that Gregory was handling an awkward situation appropriately. Henry took a deep breath. He had seen enough. These people had shown him exactly what he needed to see. The bank he helped build had become a place where human beings were judged solely by their appearance, where dignity was reserved for those who looked like they deserved it, where staff felt comfortable humiliating someone in public without knowing anything about them. It was worse than he had feared. Much worse. He was about to respond when the elevator doors opened behind Gregory. The timing was almost theatrical. Out stepped Margaret Wells, the regional director for Metropolitan Trust. Margaret was 63 years old with silver hair pulled back in a bun. She wore a gray suit and carried a leather briefcase. She had started with the bank 40 years ago as a teller and worked her way up through dedication and skill. She knew banking inside and out. More importantly, she knew Henry Clark. Margaret had been reviewing branch reports in the upstairs conference room. She happened to glance at the security monitors and saw a commotion in the lobby. When she recognized Henry on the screen, her blood ran cold. She dropped everything and rushed to the elevator. Now she emerged into the lobby and took in the scene. Henry standing there with his old sack, Gregory in full dismissal mode, Danny hovering nearby. Customers watching like this was entertainment. Staff doing nothing to help. Margaret's eyes met Henry's across the lobby. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then she moved. She crossed the marble floor quickly, her heels clicking with each step. Gregory was still talking, not noticing her approach. He was saying something about calling the police when Margaret's voice cut through the lobby like a knife. She said Gregory's name with such force that he actually jumped. Everyone turned to look at her. Margaret reached Henry and did something that shocked everyone present. She smiled warmly and spoke to him with genuine respect. She called him Mr. Clark and asked if he was all right. Her tone was concerned and deferential. Gregory's mouth fell open. Karen felt her stomach drop. Danny took a step back. The watching customers looked confused. Who was this old man that the regional director was treating like royalty? Gregory tried to explain. He said he was just handling a situation. He said this man had wandered in making demands. Margaret turned to him and her expression was ice cold. She said he was not speaking about just any man. She said he was speaking about Henry Clark, and that name should mean something to him. Gregory's face went pale. He had heard that name before in board meetings and financial reports, but he had never connected it to a real person. Certainly not to this person. The lobby was completely silent now. Margaret turned back to Henry and apologized profusely. She said there was no excuse for the treatment he had received. She said heads would roll for this. Henry just nodded slightly. His face showed no triumph or anger, just a kind of sad resignation. He had hoped to be wrong. He had hoped the bank still held on to some of its founding principles. But today had proven otherwise. The institution had lost its way completely. Margaret kept her hand on Henry's arm as if afraid he might disappear. She guided him toward the elevator while calling instructions over her shoulder. She told Gregory to come with them immediately. She told Karen to pull up all of Henry's account information. She told Danny to clear the conference room on the executive floor. Her voice carried absolute authority and people jumped to obey. The lobby remained frozen as they watched the regional director escort the shabby old man toward the elevator, like he was a visiting dignitary. Gregory followed behind, feeling his career crumbling with each step. He tried to process what was happening, but his mind refused to accept it. Henry Clark was supposed to be a name in reports, not a real person, and if he was a real person, he was supposed to look successful and powerful. He was not supposed to look like someone who might ask for spare change. Nothing about this made sense, and Gregory felt panic rising in his chest. The elevator doors closed on the three of them. Margaret pressed the button for the top floor. The ride up was silent except for the soft mechanical hum. Henry adjusted the canvas sack on his shoulder. Margaret kept glancing at him with concern mixed with anger at what had transpired. Gregory stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. When the doors opened, they stepped into a hallway lined with offices. Expensive carpet muffled their footsteps. Original paintings hung on the walls. This was where the real decisions happened, far above the everyday business of the lobby below. Margaret led them into the executive conference room. The table was polished wood that could seat 20 people. Windows overlooked the city, offering a view that cost millions. Coffee and water stations stood ready in the corner. Everything spoke of wealth and power. Henry entered and finally set down his canvas sack in one of the leather chairs. The simple bag looked absurd in these surroundings. Gregory hovered near the door, uncertain whether he should sit or stand or simply run away. Margaret told Gregory to sit. He obeyed. She remained standing and pulled out her phone. She made 3 quick calls. First to the bank president, Charles Bennett, telling him to get here immediately. Second to Human Resources, asking for personnel files. Third to her assistant, telling him to cancel all her meetings for the day. Then she turned her full attention to Henry. She apologized again, saying there were no words for how ashamed she felt. She said the bank had clearly lost sight of its values. Henry finally spoke at length. His voice was measured and thoughtful. He said Margaret should not apologize because she was not responsible. He said the problem was systemic, not individual. He said he had been testing the bank. Margaret looked confused, so Henry explained. For the past 3 months, he had been walking around Chicago testing various institutions. He dressed down and carried the old sack. He wanted to see how organizations treated people when they appeared to have no money or power or status. He told them about visiting other banks where tellers were courteous regardless of his appearance. He mentioned stores where employees offered help without judgment. He described restaurants where staff treated him with basic dignity. But he also told them about the places that failed the test. The businesses that saw his clothes and immediately assumed he was there to steal or beg. Metropolitan Trust had been his final test. His own bank. The institution he helped create. And they had failed worse than anywhere else. Gregory felt sick. He wanted to defend himself but had no defense. Everything Henry said was true. He had judged this man entirely by appearance. He had been rude and dismissive and cruel, and he had done it in front of staff and customers, setting an example that said such behavior was acceptable. Worse, he had done it to one of the bank's most important stakeholders, someone who apparently had enough power to end Gregory's career with a word. Henry opened the canvas sack. He pulled out 3 notebooks filled with handwritten observations. He set them on the polished table. He explained that each notebook documented his visits to different institutions. The 3rd notebook was dedicated entirely to Metropolitan Trust. Over the past 3 months, he had visited the bank 7 times dressed as he was now. Each time he documented how he was treated, the looks he received, the comments people made, the assumptions they projected. He flipped open to pages filled with neat handwriting. Margaret leaned over to read. She saw dates and times, names of employees who had been rude, descriptions of how security followed Henry around the lobby, notes about customers who moved away from him in line, documentation of a teller who accused him of trying to use a fake ID. It was a comprehensive record of systematic discrimination. Henry had gathered evidence like a lawyer building a case. Margaret felt her anger rising, but not at Henry. She was furious at what her bank had become. She asked Henry what he planned to do with this information. Henry said he was considering his options. One option was to divest his shares and withdraw his support entirely. He said he was tired. He said he had spent decades trying to build something meaningful, an institution that would serve everyone fairly, a bank that remembered its community roots even as it grew. But somewhere along the way, Metropolitan Trust had forgotten those principles. Gregory finally found his voice. He asked shakily how much Henry actually owned of the bank. Margaret answered for him. She said Henry Clark was one of the 3 largest individual shareholders. He owned approximately 8% of Metropolitan Trust. His shares were worth over $40 million. More than that, he was a founding investor. The bank literally would not exist without him. Gregory put his head in his hands. He had just treated a man worth $40 million like trash. He had threatened to call the police on someone who could buy and sell him 1,000 times over. But Henry corrected them.
He said this was not about money.
He said he would feel the same shame if he owned 1 share or 1 million shares. The issue was how the bank treated human beings. He said every person deserved basic courtesy and dignity. It should not matter if someone had $40 million or 40 cents. Respect was not something that should be earned through wealth. It was something every person deserved simply by being human. The door opened and Charles Bennett rushed in. The bank president was in his 50s with salt and pepper hair. He had been in a meeting across town when Margaret's call came. He made it back to the bank in record time. Now he entered the conference room and saw Henry sitting there with his old sack and worn clothes. Charles knew exactly who Henry was. They had met numerous times at board functions, but seeing him like this in these circumstances made Charles's heart sink. Charles immediately began apologizing. He said he had heard what happened in the lobby. He said it was unacceptable. He said there would be consequences. Henry held up a hand stopping him. He said apologies were easy. He said what mattered now was action. He wanted to know if the bank was willing to truly change, or if this was just damage control because they got caught treating an important investor badly. Margaret pulled up security footage on the conference room screen. She had her assistant send the files while they were in the elevator. Now they watched the encounter outside the bank entrance. They saw Brandon and Lisa making comments. They saw the crowd laughing. They saw Paul blocking Henry's way. The footage played out exactly as Henry had described. Then they watched the lobby footage. Gregory's dismissive attitude. Danny's assumptions. Karen's call for backup like Henry was a threat. The whole shameful incident captured in high definition. Charles watched in silence. His face grew darker with each passing moment. When the footage ended, he turned to Gregory. He asked if Gregory had anything to say for himself. Gregory tried to explain that he did not know who Henry was. Charles cut him off sharply. He said that was exactly the problem. Gregory treated Henry badly because he did not know he was important. That meant Gregory would treat anyone who looked poor with the same contempt. It revealed a character flaw that made him unsuitable for leadership at Metropolitan Trust. Henry spoke up. He said this was not about punishing individuals. He said Gregory and the others were products of a culture the bank had allowed to develop. A culture that valued wealth over humanity. A culture that measured people's worth by their account balances. A culture that had drifted far from the ideals the bank was founded on. Firing a few employees would not fix that. Real change required examining everything from hiring practices to training programs to performance metrics. Margaret asked what Henry wanted them to do. Henry said he was not sure yet if he wanted them to do anything. He said he needed time to think. He needed to decide if Metropolitan Trust could be saved, or if the rot had gone too deep. He said he would take his notebooks home. He would review everything he had documented, and then he would make a decision about his investment and his involvement. Charles and Margaret both looked panicked. They knew losing Henry would be catastrophic, not just financially, but morally. Henry stood up slowly. He gathered his notebooks and put them back in the canvas sack. He slung it over his shoulder. He looked around the conference room with its luxury and expense. He said he remembered when this building was just an idea sketched on a napkin. He remembered the dream of creating a bank that would serve everyone fairly, a place where a janitor could feel as welcome as a millionaire. Margaret placed her hand gently on Henry's arm before he could leave. She asked him to please stay a little longer. She said they needed to understand the full scope of what he had discovered. She said they needed to hear everything if there was any hope of fixing things. Henry looked at her tired face and saw genuine concern there. He had known Margaret for many years. She was one of the good ones. Someone who had risen through merit and maintained her integrity. He nodded slowly and sat back down. Charles ordered coffee and food brought to the conference room. Within minutes, staff arrived with pastries and sandwiches and fresh coffee. They set everything up quickly and left. Henry noticed how the staff avoided looking at him directly. Word had clearly spread through the building about what happened. Everyone now knew that the shabby old man was actually Henry Clark. The discomfort in the air was thick enough to cut. Henry poured himself coffee and added cream. The simple act seemed strange in this formal setting. Gregory remained silent in his chair, looking like he wished he could disappear. Margaret sat across from Henry with a notepad ready to take notes. Charles paced by the windows, his mind clearly racing through the implications. The city stretched out below them, indifferent to the crisis unfolding in this room. Henry began talking again. He started with the first visit 3 months ago. He had put on his oldest clothes and carried the canvas sack filled with newspapers. He entered the bank at mid-morning when it was moderately busy. Immediately, security had followed him. Not obviously, but he noticed. When he went to a teller to make a withdrawal, the woman had demanded extensive identification. She called over a supervisor to verify his account. The whole process took 20 minutes for a simple transaction that should have taken 2. The second visit was worse. Henry tried to use the ATM in the lobby. A security guard approached and asked if he needed help. When Henry said no, the guard lingered nearby watching. Other customers gave him space like he might be contagious. One woman actually pulled her daughter away. Henry successfully made his withdrawal, but the experience left him feeling unwelcome in his own institution. He described each subsequent visit, each time documenting more examples of discrimination. Staff who spoke slowly and loudly as if he might be stupid. Customers who assumed he was there to rob the place. Security protocols that seemed to apply only to people who looked poor. By the 7th visit, Henry had seen enough. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Metropolitan Trust had become a place where your treatment depended entirely on your appearance. Margaret listened, taking notes. Her anger was visible. She kept shaking her head as Henry detailed incident after incident. Charles had stopped pacing and now sat heavily in a chair. He looked devastated. This was his bank. He was responsible for its culture, and that culture had clearly gone toxic without him realizing it. Gregory remained frozen like he was hoping everyone would forget he was there. Henry pulled out photographs from his sack. He had been discreet but managed to capture images. Pictures of security following him. A photo of a teller's disgusted expression. Images of customers moving away. Signs in the bank advertising services for premium clients with minimum balances. Everything in the bank's design and operation seemed calibrated to make wealthy people feel special and everyone else feel unwelcome. He also had documentation from the bank's own website and promotional materials, advertisements featuring only wealthy-looking people, marketing that emphasized exclusive services, language about catering to high-net-worth individuals, nothing about serving the community, nothing about being accessible to regular people. The bank's public face reflected the same values he encountered in person. Wealth and status above all else. Charles asked Henry why he did this. Why go through this elaborate test? Henry explained that he was getting old. He had been thinking about his legacy. He wanted to know if the institution he helped build was still worthy of his support. He said he had other options for his money. charities that would use it well, foundations working on real problems. He did not need to keep his wealth tied up in a bank that had abandoned its principles. Henry told them about his concerns over the past few years. He had heard things, complaints from community leaders about people being turned away, stories of qualified applicants denied loans for unclear reasons, reports of fees that seemed designed to drive away small account holders. Each time he raised these issues at board meetings, he was assured they were isolated incidents. He was told the bank was performing well. Growth was strong. Shareholders were happy. But Henry never cared much about growth for its own sake. Margaret asked what was in the rest of the notebooks. Henry opened the second one. This documented his visits to competing banks. He had tested 5 other institutions using the same approach. 2 failed in similar ways to Metropolitan Trust. But 3 passed. At those banks, staff treated him courteously regardless of his appearance. Security did not follow him. Tellers processed his transactions efficiently. He felt welcome. Those banks proved it was possible to maintain professionalism and dignity for all customers. The first notebook contained something different. It was his observations of Metropolitan Trust from its founding in 1990 to now. Henry had been involved from the beginning. He documented meetings where they discussed their mission, records of decisions about how to serve the community, notes about hiring people who reflected the neighborhood, evidence of a time when the bank actually cared about more than just profit margins. Seeing those old notes made Margaret emotional. She remembered that era. She had been a young teller then full of hope. The bank felt different back then, more human, more connected to the people it served. She did not know exactly when things changed. It happened gradually over years, small decisions that seemed sensible at the time, focusing on profitable customers, streamlining operations, competing with larger banks. Each change reasonable on its own, but together they transformed the institution into something unrecognizable. Charles admitted he was part of the problem. He came to Metropolitan Trust 5 years ago from a major national bank. He brought strategies that worked in that environment. Metrics focused on account sizes and transaction volumes, performance reviews that rewarded bringing in wealthy clients, marketing aimed at the affluent. He thought he was modernizing the bank, making it competitive. He never considered what was being lost in the process. Gregory finally spoke. His voice was quiet and shaky. He said he was hired 2 years ago. From his first day, the message was clear. Focus on high-value customers. Do not waste time on small accounts. Make the bank appealing to wealth. He thought he was doing what was expected, what he was trained to do. He never questioned whether it was right. He just followed the culture that existed. But seeing Henry's documentation forced him to confront what that culture actually meant. It meant treating human beings as dollar signs. It meant dignity was conditional. It meant he had become someone he did not recognize. Henry looked at Gregory with something like sympathy. He said the young man was indeed a product of the culture, but that did not excuse the behavior. Adults had to think for themselves. They had to question whether following orders made them complicit in something wrong. Gregory nodded miserably. He understood he was likely finished at Metropolitan Trust. But more than that, he was forced to confront his own values and found them lacking. The conversation continued for another hour. Henry showed them more documentation. Margaret and Charles asked questions. They discussed specific incidents and broader patterns. The picture that emerged was troubling. Metropolitan Trust had systematically drifted away from its founding principles. The focus on wealth had corrupted everything. Hiring practices, training programs, performance metrics, marketing, physical design of branches, all of it now oriented toward making rich people feel special while making everyone else feel unwelcome. Charles asked the critical question. What would it take for Henry to stay invested? Henry was quiet for a long time. He looked out the windows at the city. He thought about all the years he had put into this bank, all the hope he had invested along with his money. He could walk away, take his $40 million and put it somewhere else. Let Metropolitan Trust face the consequences of its choices. But that would hurt innocent people too. Employees who had nothing to do with these problems. Customers who depended on the bank. The community that still needed a local institution, Henry finally answered. He said he needed to see real change. Not promises but action. Not policies but culture shift. He said he would take 2 weeks to think. During that time, he expected Charles and Margaret to develop a comprehensive plan, not just fixing obvious problems but reimagining what Metropolitan Trust should be. If the plan convinced him they were serious, he would consider staying. If not, he would divest, and they would need to explain to shareholders why one of their founding investors had lost faith completely. Margaret knew they needed context. She asked Henry to tell his full story. She wanted the newer executives to understand who he was and what he had built. She wanted them to grasp the magnitude of what they had almost destroyed. Henry hesitated. He was never one for talking about himself, but Margaret pressed. She said people needed to understand. Finally, Henry agreed. He settled back in his chair and began speaking about a life that started 72 years ago in a very different Chicago. Henry was born in 1953 on the South Side. His father worked in a factory. His mother cleaned houses. They lived in a small apartment with his 3 siblings. Money was always tight, but his parents insisted on education. They believed it was the only path forward. Henry learned early that the world would judge him harshly, that he would need to work twice as hard to get half as far. So he did. He excelled in school despite attending overcrowded classrooms with outdated books. After high school, Henry needed to work. College seemed impossible financially. He took a job as a janitor in downtown Chicago. He worked the night shift cleaning offices. The pay was minimal but enough to survive. During the day, he slept a few hours, then went to community college. He studied accounting. Numbers made sense to him. They were logical and fair in ways people often were not. A balance sheet did not care about your skin color or background. It just showed truth. Those were hard years. Henry would finish cleaning at 6 in the morning, go home and sleep until noon, attend classes until evening, study until it was time to work again. He lived on coffee and determination. His coworkers thought he was crazy. They asked why he bothered. They said guys like them did not become accountants. Henry ignored them. He had a vision of something better. By 1975, Henry had his associate degree and a job at a small accounting firm. The firm served working-class clients, people filing simple tax returns, small businesses tracking expenses. It was not glamorous, but Henry learned the trade. He was meticulous and honest. Clients trusted him. Slowly, he built a reputation. By 1980, he had saved enough to go to university full-time. He was 27 years old, sitting in classes with kids fresh from high school. But he did not care. He was finally on the path he had dreamed of. Henry earned his bachelor's degree in 1983. He got his CPA certification in 1985. That same year, he opened his own firm. Henry Clark Accounting Services operated from a tiny office on the South Side. His clients were minority-owned businesses, people who had been turned away by white accounting firms, people who needed help navigating a system designed to exclude them. Henry charged fair rates and gave honest advice. His business grew steadily, but Henry did not spend his earnings. While other successful professionals bought nice cars and bigger houses, Henry lived simply. He invested everything he could. He studied the stock market obsessively. He learned about real estate. He made smart choices and lucky bets. By 1989, his investments had grown substantially. Henry was not rich by any means, but he had built a foundation. He had capital, and he was looking for ways to use it meaningfully. In 1990, a group of local business leaders had a vision. They wanted to create a bank that would serve the community properly. Existing banks were closing branches in minority neighborhoods. They charged high fees. They denied loans to qualified applicants for unclear reasons. The community needed an institution that would treat people fairly, that would invest in local businesses, that would remember banks existed to serve people, not just extract profit. The proposed bank was called Metropolitan Trust. The founders had experience and passion but needed capital. They approached traditional investors who turned them down. The project was too risky. The neighborhood was wrong. The market was saturated. Every excuse imaginable. The dream seemed dead until someone mentioned Henry Clark, the accountant who had built something from nothing, the investor who had turned modest savings into substantial capital. Henry met with the founders in a church basement. They spread out their business plan on folding tables. They explained their vision of a community bank, a place where a single mother could get a small business loan, where an immigrant family could open their first account, where kids could learn about saving. Henry listened carefully. He asked tough questions about their financial projections. He challenged their assumptions. But underneath the skepticism, he felt something stirring. This was exactly the kind of institution he wished had existed when he was struggling. The founders expected Henry to invest maybe 10 or 20,000. Instead, he offered 200,000. It was a substantial portion of his wealth. The founders were shocked. They asked if he was sure. Henry said he had never been more sure of anything. But he had conditions. The bank must serve everyone fairly. It must focus on community development, not just profit. It must hire people who reflected the neighborhood. The founders agreed immediately. Metropolitan Trust Bank opened in 1991. Henry was listed as a founding investor, but he stayed mostly in the background. He continued running his accounting firm. He attended board meetings. He offered financial advice when asked. But he did not seek recognition or publicity. The bank was not about his ego. It was about creating something meaningful, something that would outlast him. The early years were challenging. Larger banks tried to drive them out of business. Customers were skeptical. Employees needed training. But Metropolitan Trust survived and then thrived. They did things differently. They offered financial literacy classes. They worked with borrowers who had been rejected elsewhere. They invested in local businesses. The community responded. Deposits grew. The customer base expanded. By 1995, the bank was profitable. Henry's shares increased in value as the bank grew. He never sold. Other early investors cashed out during good years. They took their profits and moved on. Henry stayed. He believed in the mission. His initial 200,000 investment grew to $500,000, then $1 million, then $5 million. By 2000, it was worth $10 million. People told Henry he should diversify. He should take some money off the table. He refused. Metropolitan Trust was not just an investment. It was his legacy. The bank continued expanding. They opened new branches. They introduced new services. They modernized their technology. Through it all, they maintained their commitment to serving everyone. Tellers were trained to treat each customer with respect. Loan officers were taught to look past superficial factors. Security was told to help people, not intimidate them. The culture remained strong. Metropolitan Trust was different from other banks. It was something special. But around 2010, things started changing. New executives came in from larger banks. They brought different ideas, different priorities. They talked about efficiency and profitability. They introduced metrics focused on account sizes. They wanted to compete with national chains. The changes seemed reasonable, small adjustments to stay competitive. But they began shifting the culture in subtle ways, Henry noticed. He raised concerns at board meetings. He was told not to worry. The bank was doing well financially. Growth was strong. Shareholders were happy. His concerns were dismissed as old-fashioned thinking. Henry was influential but not all-powerful. He could not stop the changes alone. So he watched as the institution slowly transformed. The community focus faded. The commitment to serving everyone equally eroded. Bit by bit, the bank he helped create became something different. By 2020, Henry rarely recognized Metropolitan Trust. The branches looked like upscale boutiques. The marketing targeted wealthy clients. The fees had increased. Community programs had been cut. Employees were different too. Many longtime staff had retired or quit. New hires did not share the original values. They had been trained in the new culture, the culture that valued wealth over humanity. Henry was heartbroken but felt powerless to stop it. That was why he decided to conduct his test. He needed to know for certain if his fears were justified. He needed documented evidence. So he put on old clothes and carried a sack and walked through the doors like any other person. And he discovered the truth was worse than he imagined. The bank did not just have problems. It had fundamentally betrayed everything it was supposed to stand for. His $40 million investment was in an institution that had lost its soul. After Henry finished his story, the conference room was silent. Margaret had tears in her eyes. She had been part of that journey. She remembered the early days when the bank felt like a family. She remembered believing they were building something important. Hearing Henry describe how it all fell apart made her realize how complicit she had been. She stayed quiet when she should have fought. She adapted when she should have resisted. She let the culture change because challenging it seemed too hard. Charles looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. He came to Metropolitan Trust thinking he was modernizing a small regional bank. He never understood what the bank truly represented. The history behind it, the sacrifice that built it, the communities that depended on it. He saw numbers and growth metrics. He never saw the human cost of his strategies. Now sitting across from Henry, he understood what he had helped destroy. A man had invested his life savings and 35 years of faith into an institution. And executives like Charles had casually dismantled everything that made it special. Gregory had been silent through the whole story. Listening to Henry's journey from janitor to major investor was humbling. Gregory grew up comfortable. College was paid for. His first job came through family connections. He never struggled like Henry struggled. He never had to prove himself the way Henry proved himself. Yet Gregory had the audacity to treat Henry like trash based on appearance. The shame was overwhelming. Gregory realized he was exactly the kind of person Henry created the bank to serve. But instead of serving people like his younger self, Gregory had become a gatekeeper, keeping them out. Charles stood up. He said they needed to call an emergency board meeting. Henry's ultimatum was too important to handle with just a few executives. The board needed to hear this directly. They needed to understand what was at stake. Margaret agreed and made calls scheduling the meeting for that afternoon. Board members were told attendance was mandatory. This was not a request. While Margaret made calls, Charles asked Henry if he would be willing to present his findings to the board. Henry considered this. Part of him wanted to just walk away. Let them figure it out themselves. But another part remembered his responsibility. He owned 8% of this company. Other shareholders deserved to know the truth. He owed them that much, so he agreed. He would present his documentation to the full board. The next issue was the employees involved in the morning incident. Gregory clearly had to face consequences. Charles called Human Resources. He requested full personnel files for Gregory, Brandon, Lisa, Paul, Danny, and Karen. He wanted complete records of their employment history. Any previous complaints, their performance reviews, everything. The HR director said she would have files ready within the hour. Margaret suggested they review security footage more carefully. There might be other employees involved that they missed initially. Charles agreed. They spent the next 30 minutes watching multiple camera angles from outside the bank and inside the lobby. They identified 4 more employees who participated in mocking Henry or stood by watching without intervening. Margaret made a list of names. These people would be called in one by one after the board meeting. Henry asked what would happen to them. Charles said honestly he was not sure yet. Termination seemed appropriate for some. Others might warrant suspension and retraining. They needed to investigate each case individually. Consider employment history. Look for patterns. But consequences were certain. The bank could not tolerate this behavior. Henry appreciated the response but warned against making examples just to appease him. He said real change required addressing systems, not just punishing individuals. The board meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock. That gave them 3 hours to prepare. Margaret worked with her team to create a presentation. They compiled Henry's photographs and documentation into a clear narrative. They pulled together data on customer demographics, showing how the bank had shifted toward wealthy clients. They gathered information on community programs that had been cut, marketing materials that excluded regular people, loan denial rates for different neighborhoods. The picture was damning. Charles met with the legal department. He needed to know their exposure. Could customers sue based on discriminatory treatment? Were there regulatory issues? What about public relations damage if the story leaked to media? The lawyers looked worried as they reviewed the evidence. They said the bank was likely vulnerable on multiple fronts. Discrimination lawsuits were possible. Regulatory investigation was likely. Media coverage would be devastating. They needed to get ahead of this immediately. Henry spent the time alone in the conference room. He reviewed his notebooks. He thought about what he wanted to say to the board. This was his chance to make them understand, to show them what they had lost. He felt the weight of responsibility. So many people depended on Metropolitan Trust, employees who needed jobs, customers who relied on banking services, small businesses that counted on loans. His decision would affect thousands of lives. He could not let anger or hurt drive his choices. He needed to think clearly about what was best for everyone. At 2:30, board members started arriving. They came from offices around the city. Some flew in from out of state. All were told only that there was an urgent matter regarding a major investor. They gathered in the boardroom looking confused and concerned. Most knew Henry by name, but few had met him. He was the mysterious founding investor who never attended social functions, who voted by proxy on most matters, who seemed content to let others run the show. When Henry entered carrying his canvas sack, the board members looked puzzled. Some thought he was maintenance staff. One woman asked Margaret if the room was ready. Margaret introduced Henry and watched their expressions change. Confusion became recognition. Recognition became shock. The shabby old man was Henry Clark. The Henry Clark. The founding investor who owned more shares than anyone except 2 hedge funds. He was a legend in the bank's history, but somehow had become almost mythical. Seeing him as a real person was jarring. Charles called the meeting to order. He said they had a crisis that required immediate attention. He gave a brief summary of what happened that morning. As he described the incident, board members looked increasingly horrified. When Charles mentioned they had footage, several people asked to see it. Margaret pulled up the video. The boardroom fell silent as they watched Henry being mocked and dismissed. One board member named Lawrence Peters spoke up. He was a banker himself with decades of experience. He said the footage was appalling, but wanted to understand the larger context. Why had Henry dressed that way? What was he trying to accomplish? Was this some kind of setup? His tone suggested he thought Henry might be at fault somehow. Several other board members nodded. They seemed uncomfortable blaming the bank without hearing more. Henry stood up. He did not raise his voice, but his presence commanded attention. He said he would explain everything. He opened his sack and pulled out the notebooks. He walked them through his 3-month investigation. He showed them photographs. He read excerpts from his observations. He presented data comparing Metropolitan Trust to other banks. He documented the systemic discrimination he discovered. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Lawrence tried to defend the bank. He said perhaps Henry had been unlucky, hit the bank on a bad day, encountered a few bad employees. But the culture overall was sound. Henry challenged him directly. He asked Lawrence when he last visited a branch without announcing himself. When he last saw how regular customers were treated. Lawrence admitted he usually dealt with private banking services. He rarely interacted with standard operations. Henry said that was the problem. Leadership had no idea what was happening at ground level. Another board member named Cynthia Moore asked about financial impact. She wanted to know if this affected the bottom line. Margaret pulled up customer demographic data. She showed how the bank had systematically lost small account holders over the past decade. While average account size increased, total customer count decreased. They were serving fewer people, but each person had more money. Cynthia said that seemed like good business. Focusing on profitable customers made sense. Henry felt his patience slipping. He said profitability was not the only measure of success. The bank was chartered to serve the community. It had certain obligations beyond making money. It was supposed to provide financial services to everyone, rich and poor, black and white, young and old. When it abandoned that mission, it betrayed its purpose. Cynthia looked unconvinced, but others were nodding. The board was split. Charles presented the immediate action plan. Mandatory retraining for all customer-facing staff. Review of policies and procedures. Investigation of discriminatory practices. New metrics focused on customer service quality, not just account sizes. Some board members supported the ideas. Others worried about cost and disruption. The debate grew heated. Finally, Henry stood up again. He said he would make this simple. He was giving them 2 weeks to develop a comprehensive reform plan. If the plan was inadequate, he would divest his entire stake and publicly explain why. That got everyone's attention. News of the incident spread through Metropolitan Trust faster than anyone expected. The lobby scene had been witnessed by dozens of customers and staff. People talked. They texted friends. They posted on social media. By lunchtime, everyone in the building knew that the old man treated so badly was actually Henry Clark, the founding investor, a major shareholder, someone who could buy the entire branch with pocket change. The gossip was inevitable, and the reactions ranged from shock to satisfaction to fear. Brandon Cole was at his desk reviewing market reports when his supervisor appeared. The man's face was grim. He told Brandon to come to the Human Resources office immediately. Brandon felt his stomach drop. He had heard rumors about something happening in the lobby that morning. He remembered making comments about some homeless guy, but he left for his desk before seeing how it ended. Now walking to HR, he tried to remember exactly what he said. His mind raced, trying to prepare a defense. Patricia Moore was the head of human resources. She had worked at Metropolitan Trust for 12 years. She was known for being fair but firm. When Brandon entered her office, she gestured to a chair. Another HR representative sat in the corner taking notes. Patricia pulled up security footage on her computer. She turned the monitor so Brandon could see. Then she pressed play. Brandon watched himself on screen. He saw the moment Henry approached. He heard his own voice making that comment about homeless people. He saw himself laughing with Lisa. He heard the other cruel observations he made. Watching it play back was worse than living it. On screen, he looked smug and mean. His voice dripped with contempt. This was how others saw him. This was who he had been. Brandon felt sick. Patricia asked if he had anything to say. Brandon tried to explain he was just joking around. He did not mean anything by it. He was trying to fit in with the group. Patricia cut him off. She said his intent did not matter. The impact mattered. His words contributed to humiliating a man who deserved respect. More than that, his words revealed his character. He saw someone he judged as beneath him and felt free to mock them publicly. That was not consistent with Metropolitan Trust's values. Brandon asked what was going to happen to him. Patricia said his employment was under review. For now, he was suspended without pay pending investigation. He would be notified of the final decision within a week. Brandon started to protest, but Patricia held up her hand. She said he should use this time to reflect on his behavior and choices. Then she escorted him out. Security was waiting to collect his badge and escort him from the building. Walking past his colleagues with a security guard was humiliating. People stared. Some looked sympathetic. Most looked away. Lisa Hoffman had a similar experience. She was called to HR an hour after Brandon. When Patricia showed her the footage, Lisa broke down immediately. She cried as she watched herself laughing at Henry. She apologized repeatedly, saying she did not know who he was. Patricia said that was exactly the problem. Lisa treated someone badly because she assumed he was unimportant. She never considered that every person deserved basic courtesy, regardless of who they were. Lisa asked through tears if she was fired. Patricia said not yet. Like Brandon, she was suspended pending investigation. But Patricia added something else. She said Lisa was young and might learn from this. The question was whether Lisa was genuinely remorseful or just sorry she got caught. The next week would determine her future at the bank. Lisa left the office in tears. Her career that seemed so promising that morning now hung by a thread. Paul Martinez, the security guard, was also called in. His situation was slightly different. He was following what he thought were proper protocols. He saw someone who looked out of place and responded. But the footage showed him blocking Henry's path based purely on appearance. No actual behavior triggered his response. Patricia explained this was profiling. It was discriminatory. Paul had to understand why it was wrong. He was given a written warning and required to complete additional training. One more incident and he would be terminated. Danny Cooper received the same warning. Karen Phillips faced a more serious conversation. As a senior teller with 15 years' experience, she should have known better. She should have set an example for newer staff. Instead, she participated in the discrimination. Margaret personally handled Karen's review. She was disappointed. Karen had always been a good employee, but this incident showed a blind spot that needed addressing. Karen was suspended for 2 weeks without pay and required to complete extensive retraining before returning. Gregory Nash faced the worst consequences. Charles met with him privately. Charles said Gregory's behavior was unacceptable for any employee, but especially for someone in leadership. He was the assistant bank manager. He set the tone for staff. His treatment of Henry revealed deep problems with his judgment and values. Charles said after reviewing everything they decided to terminate Gregory's employment effective immediately. Gregory nodded numbly. He expected this. He asked if he could say goodbye to his team. Charles said security would escort him out within the hour. He could collect personal items but needed to do it quickly. Gregory stood on shaky legs. He had worked so hard to reach this position. He had an expensive apartment and car payments and student loans. Everything was about to come crashing down. But more than the financial concerns, he felt the weight of shame. He had treated another human being cruelly. He had been the person he never wanted to be. While individual employees faced consequences, the bank leadership worked on broader changes. Charles and Margaret formed a task force to review all policies and procedures. They brought in consultants who specialized in diversity and inclusion. They interviewed staff at all levels asking about the culture. They surveyed customers gathering feedback. The picture that emerged confirmed Henry's assessment. The bank had drifted badly from its founding principles. The task force identified multiple problem areas: hiring practices that favored candidates from elite universities, training programs that emphasized serving wealthy clients, performance metrics that rewarded large account sizes, marketing that excluded regular people, physical design of branches that felt intimidating, dress codes for customers that were enforced selectively, fee structures that penalized small accounts, loan policies that discriminated against certain neighborhoods. The list went on. Margaret took charge of developing solutions. She proposed mandatory training for all staff focused on treating everyone with dignity, new hiring practices to ensure diverse candidates, revised performance metrics that measured customer service quality, marketing that reflected the whole community, redesigning branches to be more welcoming, eliminating discriminatory policies, creating a community advisory board, establishing programs to serve underbanked populations. It was ambitious and would be expensive. Some board members resisted. They worried about costs and disruption. They argued the bank was profitable as it was. Why risk that for feel-good initiatives that might not work? Lawrence Peters was especially vocal. He said Henry was overreacting. One bad incident did not mean the whole institution was broken. They should discipline the specific employees involved and move on. Other problems were being exaggerated. Margaret confronted Lawrence directly. She said he was exactly the kind of board member who let this happen. He collected his director fees and voted for strategies that maximized short-term profits. He never asked about the human cost. He never visited branches to see how customers were treated. He never talked to community leaders about concerns. He was happy as long as his investment grew. That attitude created the culture that failed Henry. Lawrence was furious. He said Margaret was out of line. He threatened to call for her removal. But other board members supported Margaret. They had seen the evidence. They understood the severity. Cynthia Moore surprised everyone by switching her position. She said after thinking about it, she agreed with Henry. The bank had lost its way. Profitability meant nothing if they achieved it by betraying their values. She would support whatever changes were necessary. The debate continued for hours. Finally, Charles called for a vote. The question was whether to fully support the reform initiative or take a more limited approach. The board split initially, but slowly votes shifted. By the end, a majority supported comprehensive reform. It was not unanimous. Lawrence and 2 others voted against it. But it was enough. Metropolitan Trust would undergo major changes. Charles immediately held a company-wide meeting. Every employee was required to attend either in person or by video. He stood before them and explained what happened. He showed them the footage of Henry being mistreated. He read excerpts from the notebooks. He laid out the reform plan. He said anyone not willing to embrace these changes should leave now. The bank was returning to its roots. They would serve everyone with dignity or they would not work there. The reaction was mixed. Some employees were relieved. They had been uncomfortable with the direction the bank was taking but felt powerless to change it. Others were worried about their jobs. They had been doing what they thought management wanted. Now they were being told it was all wrong. A few were angry. They thought the bank was overreacting. They believed Henry had set them up. But most people were willing to try. They wanted to be part of something meaningful. 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. The task force worked around the clock developing the reform plan. Margaret led the effort with fierce determination. She interviewed dozens of staff members and customers. She visited every branch personally. She consulted with community leaders and advocacy groups. She reviewed policies line by line. She was driven by guilt over letting things deteriorate and determination to fix them. This was her chance to restore what the bank once was. Henry spent those 2 weeks at home. He reviewed his notebooks repeatedly. He thought deeply about what he wanted. Part of him was tempted to just walk away, sell his shares and invest the money elsewhere. Let Metropolitan Trust face the consequences of its failures. He was 72 years old. He had earned the right to rest. But another part of him could not let go. This bank represented 35 years of his life. It was built with his money and sweat and hope. Walking away felt like abandoning his life's work. On the 14th day, Charles called. He said the plan was ready. He asked if Henry would come review it. Henry agreed. He dressed in his usual clothes. Nice slacks and a pressed shirt. The clothes of a successful businessman. He left the canvas sack at home. When he arrived at the bank, the reception was dramatically different. Security greeted him respectfully by name. Staff held doors and smiled warmly. Customers looked at him with curiosity. Word had spread about who he was. Margaret presented the reform plan in the conference room. It was comprehensive. She started with immediate actions. All customer-facing staff would complete 3 days of intensive training, focused on dignity and respect. The training would be mandatory. Anyone refusing would be terminated. New hiring practices would emphasize character and empathy over credentials. Job postings would be distributed in diverse communities, not just elite universities. Performance metrics would change completely. Tellers and customer service staff would be evaluated on satisfaction scores from all customers, not just large account holders. Mystery shoppers representing different demographics would test branches monthly. Loan officers would be assessed on their willingness to work with challenging cases, not just approval rates. Bonuses would be tied partly to community impact measures. Marketing would be overhauled. The new campaign would feature real customers from the community. All types of people. Different ages and races and income levels. The message would emphasize accessibility and service. Ads would run in community newspapers and local radio, not just business publications. The goal was showing everyone they were welcome. Physical branches would be redesigned. The intimidating marble and brass would be replaced with warmer materials. Seating areas would be comfortable and accessible. Information about services would be displayed prominently. ATMs would be placed for privacy and accessibility. Everything would signal openness rather than exclusion. The redesign would cost millions, but Margaret argued it was essential. Fee structures would change. Minimum balance requirements would decrease. Overdraft policies would be more forgiving. Small account holders would not be penalized for being small. The bank would actually lose money on some accounts, but Margaret argued that was part of serving the community. Not every interaction had to be profitable. Some were investments in relationships and trust. A community advisory board would be created. Members would represent different neighborhoods and demographics. They would meet quarterly with bank leadership. They would have real input on policies and practices. Their feedback would be taken seriously, not just collected and ignored. This would keep the bank accountable to its mission. New programs would launch. Financial literacy classes for adults and teens, small business development support, microloans for entrepreneurs, partnerships with community organizations, college scholarship funds, all aimed at helping people build financial stability. These programs would cost money but would fulfill the bank's purpose. Henry listened carefully. He asked tough questions. How would they ensure training actually changed behavior? What metrics would prove the reforms were working? How would they handle employees who resisted? Who would serve on the community board, and how would they be selected? What happens if programs did not achieve their goals? Margaret had answers. She had thought through everything. Charles added financial projections. The reforms would cost approximately $8 million in the first year. Ongoing costs would be around $3 million annually. Profitability would decrease by roughly 5%. Some investors would be unhappy. Stock price might dip. But Charles argued the alternative was worse. If Henry divested and explained why the scandal would destroy far more value. Beyond money, the bank would lose its soul completely. Henry sat quietly thinking. Margaret and Charles waited nervously. Finally, Henry spoke. He said the plan was good, better than he expected. It addressed the problem seriously. But plans were just words on paper. What mattered was execution. He wanted quarterly reports on progress. He wanted to see training materials before they were used. He wanted input on advisory board selection. And he wanted a seat on the board of directors. This surprised them. Henry had always declined board positions before. He preferred working behind the scenes. But now he explained that oversight required presence. He needed to be in the room where decisions were made. He needed to speak up when the bank started drifting again. Because it would drift. That was human nature. Organizations always defaulted to the path of least resistance. Maintaining values required constant vigilance. Charles and Margaret immediately agreed. Henry's board position was approved by unanimous vote. Lawrence Peters had resigned from the board after the reform vote. 2 other skeptical members left as well. That made room for new directors, including Henry. The board would be stronger and more aligned with the mission, but Henry had one more condition. He wanted to create something new. He would donate $5 million from his dividends to establish the Clark Community Banking Initiative. The fund would provide small business loans to underserved entrepreneurs, college scholarships for students from low-income families, financial education programs, emergency assistance for families in crisis, and Metropolitan Trust would match his contribution dollar for dollar. $10 million dedicated to serving the community. Margaret was moved to tears. Charles looked stunned. Henry explained his thinking. He was wealthy beyond his needs. His investments had been very successful. He could not take the money with him when he died. Creating this initiative would ensure his values outlived him. It would force the bank to maintain its community focus, and it would help real people build better lives. That was what mattered. The news of Henry's decision and the reform plan spread quickly. Media picked up the story. A major investor criticizes his own bank, then funds massive reforms. It was compelling narrative. Reporters wanted interviews. Henry declined most but agreed to a few. He explained carefully what happened and why. He did not name individual employees. He focused on systemic problems and solutions. His measured tone impressed people. Community response was overwhelmingly positive. Leaders who had been critical of Metropolitan Trust expressed cautious optimism. They said they would judge the bank by actions, not promises. But they appreciated the acknowledgement of problems. Several offered to help with the Community Advisory Board. They wanted to be part of building something better. 3 weeks after the incident, Metropolitan Trust held a public town hall. The event was held at a community center in the neighborhood where the bank first opened. Hundreds of people attended. Media cameras lined the walls. Henry sat on stage with Charles and Margaret and several board members. This was their chance to show the community they were serious. Charles opened with a detailed apology. He explained exactly what happened to Henry. He acknowledged it was not an isolated incident but symptom of deeper problems. He outlined the failures in culture and policy. He took personal responsibility as the leader. His voice cracked with emotion. This clearly mattered to him. He was not reading a corporate script. He was speaking from genuine remorse. Margaret presented the reform plan. She went through each element explaining how it would work. She introduced the Community Advisory Board concept and invited applications. She discussed the training programs. She showed redesigned concepts for branches. She detailed the new programs. People listened carefully. Some looked skeptical. Others looked hopeful. All were paying attention. Then Henry spoke. He stood slowly and approached the microphone. He looked out at the crowd and saw faces that reminded him of his younger self. People who worked hard. People who struggled. People who deserved dignity. He began by saying he was not interested in revenge or punishment. He did not want headlines or sympathy. He wanted change. Real structural change that would ensure what happened to him never happened to anyone else. He told them about his journey. Growing up poor, working as a janitor, studying accounting, building a business, investing in the bank. He explained why he did the test. He wanted to know if his life's work had meaning or if it had all been wasted. The test showed the bank had failed, but it also showed the possibility of redemption. Institutions could change if people demanded it. Henry announced the Clark Community Banking Initiative. He explained the $5 million donation and the matching funds.